Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined right now by Dave Richard, joined in the next 20 minutes by Dan Schneier. That's right. It's a three-man show, Dave. I can only presume that Dan is currently finishing up the coldest round of golf known to man.
It's either that or else he forgot about the show, overslept, and was like in his PJs eating Frosted Flakes when he realized, oh man, I'm on Heath's Dynasty show today, and now he's racing to get ready to go.
And we've got our YouTube poll. Is Dan going to show up in his pajamas or in his golf attire? Probably the answer is neither.
It's possible that it's the same attire either way.
He just sleeps in his golf clothes, or he golfs in his pajamas.
Would you put it past him? The guy used to do shows in his bathroom.
He was Dan on the can. Now he's Dan without the plan, but he's going to be here in just a little bit. We are on today's show talking about my Dynasty tiers. I update Dynasty rankings once a week during the season, once a month during the off season, and a few times a year I put together these Dynasty tiers. And Dave, you've done tiers for decades in terms of redraft content. And I always find it interesting, the discussion of like, what are you trying to do when you tier players? There are some players that put them together kind of by archetype. These are the guys who, the young running backs who could be workhorses, and the old running backs who may only have 1 year left, and so on and so forth. There's some people I know when you talk a lot about like ADP when you're putting together your tiers. Mm-hmm. I am kind of with mine searching for like, who do I value the most similarly for the purposes of trades? So you will see rookies in the same tier as 30-year-olds. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight how you go about your tiers. I do like to put players of similar value and expectations in the same tier. And I think that's a lot harder to do in Dynasty. But I think if I did do Dynasty tiers, it would be, all right, here are the players that are going to play. They're going to be like top 5 wide receivers for 5+ years. I don't want to look further than 5+ years. All right, so that would be the first tier. And then the second tier would be, all right, here are the players that might be elite for 3 to 5 years. And then just right on down until we get to a tier where it's, here are wide receivers. So as long as it's that type of layout, as long as people can understand what you're going for, I think it's important, and I think it's good.
So I think we'll just start before we even take our first break. I want to get to the quarterback position because I think that how you tier players and what your goal is of this operation really comes into play when you look at that position and the way that it stands right now in Dynasty Fantasy Football. This top tier for a long time has included the name Patrick Mahomes. This top tier, I think, for a lot of people might include the name Jaden Daniels after the last couple of weekends. But tier 1, Dave, I have just Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. And it's basically like, if I was going to define that tier, it would be quarterbacks who have shown us truly elite fantasy upside and were elite this year. Like the Allen and Jackson are kind of the only two guys that fully meet that. We've seen them both be over 30 fantasy points per game. Nobody did that this year. They were the 2 of the top 3 quarterbacks in fantasy football this season. Is that first tier too small though?
I think you're missing one name. I think you're missing Joe Burrow. And maybe you're missing Burrow because you're worried about, his injury history. This is really like the first year. It seems like ever, but really the first year where he's played every game, no issues, seems fine. Maybe you're worried about what his receiving core will look like, but he's the same age range as Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. He still has plenty of upside. He's a phenomenal thrower. He's going to have Jamar Chase for the next 5+ years. He's going to play the next 5+ years. I'm not saying I would put him ahead of Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson, but this would be one of the players that I would put into that top tier along with Josh and Lamar.
And I owe Baker Mayfield an apology because he was actually ahead of Josh Allen. Allen was QB4 this year in terms of fantasy points per game. But I guess if I was pushing back on Burrow at all, it would be one, the T. Higgins question, because he has been a different fantasy quarterback when he's had both Chase and Higgins versus when those guys have missed time. And then the second thing would be, like, we'd agree this was the best fantasy season of Joe Burrow's career.
We
right?
don't have to agree. The stats say it.
Okay. So he in this, and as a rule, like if you're 5 years into a guy's career, was he 4 years maybe? And he just had 5 years. He just had his career year. Like, we don't necessarily think this is just the new normal. He's probably going to be somewhere between this and what he's been in the past. And that career year was 27 fantasy points per game. Well, we saw Lamar score 30 fantasy points per game this year. We've seen Lamar do that in all the other seasons. We've seen Josh Allen flirt with that 30 number. He was only at 25.5 this year. We've seen Patrick Mahomes give us a season over 30 fantasy points per game. I guess if I was, and Jalen Hurts has gotten closer than Burrow did this year, but I guess if I was just like looking at tier 2 with Mahomes, with Burrow, with Hurts, and with Jaden Daniels, for me, the reason that Burrow belongs there is I'm not sure that he actually does have as much upside as Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson.
We did see Joe Burrow average 26.3 fantasy points per game in 2022. I view T. Higgins as a huge catalyst for Burrow. I agree with you, but I don't view T. Higgins as an irreplaceable player, meaning that I think the Bengals could eventually, I'm not saying they're going to be able to do it immediately in 2025, but maybe by 2026, have a wide receiver who steps up and is 80% to 100% of what T. Higgins has been. So I'm a big believer in Joe Burrow, and I think he can elevate his pass catchers as well. Not really that concerned about him falling off to a level where he's at. What was he at last year? It was like 17-7, but that includes games healthy and throwing as much. And then just by comparison, Lamar Jackson averaged 23.7 last year, 22.5 the year before that, 21.6 the year before that. And so he's had a string of years where he's had moments of monster games, but he really hasn't been, as consistent as Josh Allen, let's say, where Allen and Azers talked about this on the main Fantasy Football Today show. 26 plus fantasy points per game each of the last 4 years, 5 years, something like that. I think that's the gold standard. I think Allen is the gold standard. And we can talk about Lamar Jackson and how amazing he was this year, but it's his first year in 4 where he's been north of 24 fantasy points per game. And Burrow's done that in 2 of his last 3.
Yeah, I think the thing we've talked about a lot with Lamar Jackson throughout the years, he is the poster boy for Azer stats. Because of the partial games, because of the time that he's missed with injury. Burrow's had the same problem. I think when you look at that tier 2, it seems to be general consensus that Patrick Mahomes is a tier 2 dynasty quarterback. It seems to be general consensus that Jalen Hurts is a tier 2 dynasty quarterback. You argued for Burrow in tier 1. We had a question from Joe in the chat. He says, if Jaden does what he did this year, next year, would he belong in that first tier? And I think it's worth just, again, I like to have the numbers up in front of me so we can just talk about what just happened. Sure. Jalen Daniels finished this year with an average of 23.5 fantasy points per game. Awesome. For a rookie, spectacular. If you just want to look at week 1 through 17, it's 24.7. So even better. I'm not sure that does get him into tier 1, though. Like, we need to see something closer to what Joe Burrow did this year, right?
Would you care to know what he did in his final 6 games? And then getting even more granular, his final 6 games if you throw out week 18.
So 5 of his final 6 games?
Right. So his final 6 games, he was at 30.4. Yeah. This is when he was recovered from the rib injury. The offense was much more open to him as far as passing the football. I think they did more no huddle toward the end of the season as well. And they started to get some good play from other wide receivers other than Terry McLaurin. And then if you chop off week 18, now it's 5 games, it's 35.6. Like, that's how bad week 18 was. I don't know how much they were really trying in that game against Dallas. say what you will about week 18 now. I do think that if the Commanders add another wide receiver and they bulk up their offensive line a little bit more, I think you can make the case for Jaden Daniels to belong in that first tier. I think he's got the upside to be around 26 fantasy points per game over the course of 17 games, not just for 5 or 6 games toward the end of the year. And I think there's no question that he's a great passer. We saw this. We were talking about this, Heath. You tell me, March of 2024, just how good of a thrower he was in college, and now he's brought it into the NFL, knows what he's doing out there, and he can run. So there's a lot to be excited about. I would say this. If you're in a dynasty startup any point in the next 6 months, you will see people go and take Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson first and second. Do not be surprised if Daniels goes third, because people are betting on the upside based on what we've seen this year. And honestly, what we saw from him as he developed in college.
Now, he was better from a fantasy points per game basis than CJ Stroud was as a rookie, but we did see CJ Stroud ranked right in this range, tiered right in this range after his rookie season. Any concern at all about a sophomore slump from Daniels?
You have to be concerned about some sort of slump, but here's where I think there's a very obvious difference and there's a very subtle difference. The obvious difference is CJ Stroud doesn't run, Jaden Daniels will. So that's going to add the floor to his fantasy production as long as he keeps running. I think the subtle difference is we saw the Commanders' offense evolve and get bigger and get more aggressive as the season went on. I don't want to tout Cliff Kingsbury too much, and I think he's going to stay in Washington and be their offensive coordinator into 2025. But I am fairly optimistic that they will be able to develop their offense and add layers onto it that make a good example being they do what the Texans just did, which is add these wide receivers to make their offense even more explosive. Hopefully those wide receivers don't have offseason issues, don't tear an ACL in the middle of the year, and hopefully the offensive line doesn't regress. I felt like the Texans offense kind of changed for the worse for CJ Stroud. I don't think that the play design was quite as good. I think the offensive line had injuries and also just wasn't as good. And I think adding Joe Mixon just for the games that Mixon was there and healthy, I think that impacted what CJ Stroud does as a thrower too. And those differences, if those come to pass in Washington, then yeah, Daniels could be worse in his second year. But just like what I'll say about Stroud is that I think Houston can go back to the drawing board, and I think that they can build off of all their mistakes this year and possibly have a bounce back year for Stroud next year. I'm not ready to write off Stroud. And if Daniels has a down year in his second year, I wouldn't be ready to write off Daniels in his third year.
That's the top 6 quarterbacks in Dynasty, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Let's take a short break. We'll get to the Tier 3 and Tier 4 right after this. This is really, Dave, where things already start to get a little bit haywire in the tiering process. I've got 5 quarterbacks in Tier 3. Caleb Williams, Justin Herbert, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, and Kyler Murray. There's a wide range of skills and abilities in this group. And I don't know how I would define it necessarily, but what stands out amongst those 5 as he should be higher or he should be lower?
So the first thought in my head is how many of these quarterbacks are still going to be starting and effective for their NFL teams in 2 years? I would say all 5. How many of them are still going to be there in 3 years? I think I'd say all 5, but I'm not 100% locked in on Love or Kyler. What about 5 years from now? I think the only quarterback in Tier 3, the names you just said, Caleb, Herbert, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, Kyler Murray, the only one that I'd feel really confident in still being a factor in fantasy 5 years from now is Justin Herbert. It's the only one. And so I'm not ready to say that like, oh, he should be in his own tier or Justin Herbert should be in Tier 2. I just think that he's probably the best of this group that I would trust if I'm starting. I'm going to reference this a lot, Heath. If I'm starting a dynasty team and I can't get one of the first 6 quarterbacks that we named, Herbert would probably be the guy that I would look at 7th.
And it's interesting, and Dan is here, and we're all so excited about it. And I want to give Dan an impossible task to welcome him onto the show, Dan, because I don't know how many people will get this right. But when I go look at the fantasy points per game of these 5 quarterbacks in 2024, fantasy points per game, how do you think they ranked?
Okay, fantasy points per game, the 5 in tier 3, I assume. Okay.
Yes.
I think points per game, we'd have Brock 1. We'd have, this is where it gets tricky. We might have Caleb 2. It's weird as it sounds, but I'm not going to put it there yet. He had so many big games too, Caleb. People don't remember, but he did have some really bad 6-point games too. All right, we're not going to do that. We're going to do Brock 1. That's easy. Kyler, Herbert, Love, Caleb. I switched up the Caleb.
You nailed it, Dan. Nailed it. 20.5 fantasy points per game for Brock Purdy, the clear QB1 of this group. Kyler at 19.8, Herbert at 19.1, Love at 18.5, Caleb at 16.9. I love the fact that you were like debating, was Caleb QB2? And then when you actually put them in order, it was just clear that Caleb was. So I think it makes sense. Like, he's by far the youngest. He was a rookie. We're just kind of washing that away. Dave was making the case for Herbert kind of at the top of this tier because he feels the best about his long-term future as a NFL starter. I guess my only question is, like, we watch the tape of Justin Herbert, and people who evaluate tape of Justin Herbert are very confident that he's a very, very good NFL quarterback. But that hasn't actually translated into very much NFL success. And in the same way, it's been kind of lacking in fantasy success recently as well. Do we actually get Justin Herbert as a starting fantasy quarterback again soon?
I think he's probably going to be fringe for a while, just given what we have at the top of the position and how many players we have above him who run and add value via the run. Even players I see behind him, Bo Nix, Drake May, there's a possibility like they both outperform him from a fantasy points per game standpoint next year, just based on the fact they're both going to be running a lot. It makes such a difference in fantasy. We've talked about this at length throughout the years. So he did run a little bit toward the end of the season when he was healthier and then got rebanged up. Kind of the question comes down to me, like, will we ever see a fully healthy Justin Herbert again? He's had so many injuries throughout his career. Because if he is, I think that system, if they're going to keep it, and I think they will with Roman and Harbaugh, does lead itself to some upside for the quarterback position running the football. And we saw it a little bit at times. So to me, it kind of comes down to that. Will we see an evolution of his game in that regard from a fantasy standpoint? Will he run more? Without it, it becomes a situation where, you're back to all of these pocket guys like CJ Stroud this year, probably the biggest miss in fantasy at the quarterback position by far. And when you look at it from a whole, it's like, well, was this really that difficult for us to see? Sure, on one hand, he had all 3 receivers and it looked great on paper. On the other hand, it's a quarterback year 2 in a system. They're going to take away concepts, and he doesn't give you that rushing floor. It just, when you don't have that rushing floor, I feel like it's very difficult to maintain your value in fantasy at quarterback.
Yeah, and if you thought it sounded like I was being too hard on Justin Herbert, like just in terms of fantasy points per game, he was QB 17 in 2022, 0.4 of a point behind Daniel Jones.
Yeesh.
In 2023, he was once again QB 10 in 2023, tied with looks like Mahomes. So a little bounce back up to QB 10. Last year falls back down into that QB 15, QB 17 range. I'd love to see another year like we saw in 2021. He was QB 16 last year, half a point better than Russell Wilson. Dave, with tier 4, it's the young guys, but I don't think you could have a real strong certainty that any of them are going to be a starting quarterback in 5 years yet. We think Drake May is probably the most likely, but Drake May, Bo Nix, and then 2 guys that are just impossible to tier, Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud. Do you have a strong preference in this group, Dave?
I think this is where you might look for a quarterback. If you take the last quarterback in tier 3 and you want to get a second guy that might have more long-term upside, I think May and Nix offer that. I'm not ready to write off CJ Stroud because of one bad year. I worry about Anthony Richardson being a starting quarterback 2 years from now.
Yeah.
Like if he's if he's terrible to start next season, the Colts might bench him and not bring him back.
100%.
And so
also,
there's so much. I've got him on one of my dynasty teams. So much risk with him. And the reward, it's great because of that rushing floor. We can keep talking about it, but everybody knows what it is, so let's not. Can he win games with that rushing floor? He's got to become a better thrower. This is the make or break off season for Anthony Richardson. He's probably appropriate in this tier 4 range, but I still like Drake May a lot long term, and Bo Nix too. Like I don't know if he can ever be anything better than what we were talking about with Justin Herbert. He could be around 20 fantasy points per game for the next 5 years. It wouldn't surprise me in the least, but I don't know if he can evolve into being any better than that as we move forward.
I guess the way I'd say it is I think it's really unlikely that Anthony Richardson finishes in a similar range as Drake May, Bo Nix, and CJ Stroud in the next 3 years, but he has a better chance, in my opinion, than all of them to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback and a better chance to get replaced in the middle of the 2025 season. And you've got to tier those guys somewhere. I would say Richardson moves up if you're talking about a 1 quarterback league, because I don't care what the floor is. And he moves down if you're talking about a super flex league, because the floor really matters a lot. And he has almost no floor. We're going to quickly turn the page, Dan. Tier 5 shares almost nothing with tier 4. It's 3 old performers, Jared Goff, Dak Prescott, and Baker Mayfield. You have any concern, Dan, about the next 2 to 3 years with any of these 3 quarterbacks?
Good, interesting question. Concern, I would say least concerned about Goff, despite losing Ben Johnson. The infrastructure there really has me excited about just a safe, I guess, floor for him. Dak and Baker, that's interesting. Baker's already proven he can kind of make it work despite losing his coordinator. He lost Canales. Now he's going to lose Cohn, it looks like. I don't think that's official yet, but it's close with Cohn going to Jacksonville. Mike Evans will retire soon, so he'll lose that. Godwin, we don't know the status of that and if he's going to move forward with the team. It seems like Baker's done a good job, though, utilizing receivers like McMillan, even Sterling Shepard at times. So I don't think that's a big reason for his success, the receivers he's had. It is, of course, but I don't think it's a crutch. So I would say the one I'm maybe most concerned about would be Dak Prescott. Just so much of what Prescott does, he wins with his mind. He wins with the processing, the post-snap processing. And when I watch the Cowboys, a lot of it is just quick game, or it was this year at least, which is great, and it works. It doesn't really provide that much of a fantasy ceiling, I don't think. And I said this, I guess, 3 years ago now on FFT. Once he had that first ankle injury, I said they will not use him as their zone read runner in the red zone anymore, and they haven't. His touchdowns as a runner have gone down significantly since that injury, and his running in general has gone down. So he fits into the billing I was discussing before. Like, he has to do it with his arm to have fantasy success. We have enough people who are running at this point that, like, you really got to throw 35 TDs, 4K yards to get into that QB1 status. I don't really feel like Dak Prescott has a good opportunity to continue that moving forward. So he would be the one I'm most concerned with.
Well, tier 6, I'm just going to ask you both a rapid fire question, because if we take this long on all 4 positions, we're going to be here for 2 hours. Dave, Trevor Lawrence, Michael Penix, Tua, JJ McCarthy, Bryce Young, that's tier 6. I kind of call it the $20 scratcher group, because there's certainly some upside there, but it's not a cheap scratcher. Like, these guys all still cost something, and they could all still go to 0 very, very soon.
Penix is the one that I'm targeting just because he's the youngest. As far as talent goes, or McCarthy might actually be younger than Penix.
McCarthy's like 6 years younger, I think.
Yeah. I would probably rank it Penix, McCarthy, Lawrence, Young, Tua. And I know that sounds crazy, but I think if we're just strictly looking at long view, I think that's kind of maybe not crazy, because we don't know how much longer Tua is going to play. Is Tua about to embark on a make or break year with the Dolphins? I would argue that he is. And so putting him in tier 6, if he has an awesome season, Dolphins actually make the playoffs, win a playoff game, then he'll be a factor for a while. But the other thing I'll say is, how many quarterbacks did we name before we even got to this tier? Has to be 12. Has to be probably in the neighborhood of 15. So a lot of these quarterbacks, these are backups in a 1 QB league. I don't know if I'm really thinking about Bryce Young or Trevor Lawrence as a backup quarterback, one that I would prioritize anyway, compared to somebody like Penix and McCarthy.
we're at 19 through 23 with this group here. And that was just for the record, Bryce Young also, I think, at least a year younger than Michael Penix. Trevor Lawrence, a couple months older than Michael Penix. He's old. Dan, who's your favorite of this group?
For me, it's actually Trevor Lawrence. Look, I'm excited about Liam Cohen going there. I know it's been bad for him. I know really it's banking on just one stretch of good fantasy success. It started with that Baltimore game, I think 3 years ago now at this point, or 2 seasons ago, 2 full seasons ago. So it's a little hopium, but I just look at the arm talent and I look at the ability upside as a rusher, if that can be a part of his game. But the other guy for me would be Bryce Young. The strides he took on tape in the second half were phenomenal. He was one of the best anticipatory throwers in the entire NFL. And to me, that's the trait that stands out. It's a trait that keeps you with a starting job. It's a trait that leads to explosive plays in the passing game. So if they can figure out a way to get him some more explosive weapons and a better O-line to kind of operate behind, then to me, he has a chance to be that rare type of quarterback, because we know one thing with Bryce Young we learned this year. He's willing to and able to get you points with his legs. And that's something we saw this year. He's really agile, laterally agile in a phone booth to make defenders miss. So Bryce and Lawrence would be my 2 guys. Bryce, maybe even 1.
Let's move over to the to Dave.
Just for a quick second, could it be a good strategy in a startup to target one of the value older quarterbacks? You could talk about Goff or Baker Mayfield for this example. Get one of them and then maybe get 2 of JJ McCarthy, Bryce Young, Michael Penix, and throw Trevor Lawrence in there too, since he's effectively the same age as Penix. And then you've got a guy for now and a guy maybe for later, and somebody who could be very good later on. I like that idea.
Yes, it's not a bad strategy. It is pretty cheap. Let's go to the running back position, and this is this position going through this process really kind of shocked me. Just because thank goodness we've got 20 NFL running backs coming in the next draft class, because man, do we need them. The first 2 tiers, 3 running backs, Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs in tier 1, Devon Achane, my only running back, in tier 2. This is probably not enough names for the top, Dan. Who am I missing?
I mean, the idea would be you could potentially be missing Breece Hall. That's the question, right? Because going into last year, this time, if we'd recorded this time last year, Breece Hall would be tier 1. He wouldn't even be a consideration for tier 2. Now he's not in one of tier 1 or tier 2. Of course, things seem to have changed a lot for Breece Hall from year to year. They are using more running backs. Braylon Allen looks really good there. They even worked in, I forget who, toward the end of the season, who looked okay in that backfield. So maybe as we move forward with Aaron Glenn's coaching staff, we don't really know exactly what that's going to shape up as. Obviously, he's just hired, and we don't know what the offensive direction is going to be, but it might be a multi-back system, which takes away a lot of that upside. Bijan's kind of operating in a multi-back system. Jahmyr Gibbs is, at least for now. Devon Achane kind of is. Wasn't really from a usage standpoint this year. So you can make the case that all these guys, no one really has the full backfield at this point. But we didn't really see the splash plays from Breece Hall this year either. We didn't see the operation in the passing game, which we saw be a big part of his fantasy success in past seasons. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, but that would be the guy I would put up there just from a pure talent standpoint.
That's the thing, is he'll be 24 before he plays another football game. And that's not old at running back. He's just entering his prime. That's great. But he's also entering year 4, and he does not have a 1,000-yard rushing season. He does not have a 10-touchdown season. And this team looks like it's probably going to be awful offensively once again. And so, Dave, as we turn the page to tier 3, we find Breece Hall in the same tier as Kyren Williams and Jonathan Taylor. And immediately it feels like people look at the names Kyren Williams and Breece Hall in the same tier, and they think, oh, I want Breece Hall. Gross. I don't want Kyren Williams. And Kyren Williams has been so much better than him the last 2 seasons. Why does everyone hate Kyren Williams?
I think they don't like him because he doesn't have the pedigree. And I don't know. He's a year older than Breece Hall.
I don't think it's totally that just because of the pedigree. Like, at least my opinion, because I'm extremely low on Kyren from a dynasty standpoint. I understand what the other side of it is. But it's also just the idea of, like, when does this Rams restart? Because if Stafford's done there,
they might be as bad as the Jets next year.
That's the thing, or worse. Like,
they're back in playoff contention again because Stafford's not going away, and that offensive line is pretty good.
Everything is good, but I just personally can't underestimate or overestimate Sean McVay in that regard, as far as if you don't have a quarterback in this league, I just think you go nowhere in the NFL. And you just they have no solution for getting a quarterback if Stafford does move on from this team and retire. They won too many games. Like, that's it. Like, you can maybe hope to get lucky, but that's not really how the draft works. I guess you can hope for like Jameis or something like that, who can keep an offense from a fantasy standpoint on a little bit of a track in that regard. If I'm talking from a fantasy standpoint with Kyron, but if Stafford's gone, like, what do you have for Kyron at that point? You have the O-line, but you have no offense. And it's not just the pedigree with the history of injuries. There's a lot there that I just don't love about Kyron.
Yeah. I mean, what I'll tell you is, like, if you're looking for it, I don't know that elite running back production from a 24 or 25-year-old has ever been cheaper. Like,
True.
if you normally you
That's
cannot find 24 and 25-year-old RB1s that people are just like, man, please give me a first.
Yeah.
And like, normally you got to pay 2 or 3 firsts to get that.
True.
So don't hesitate to take advantage of that possibility. In tier 5, we're already squirrely. Like, the first 6 running backs, or I'm sorry, tier 4, the first 6 running backs, I feel pretty good about all those guys. I know Dan doesn't like Kyron. Nobody likes Kyron. I'm fine with that. I love the top 6. We get to number 7, and we already have a 28-year-old running back in Saquon Barkley. And tier 4 is Barkley, Bucky Irving, Chase Brown, Ken Walker, James Cook. Dave, Irving and Brown are the 2 types of backs that for the last couple of, or at least the last decade, I've heard people in Dynasty beware of that day 3 or UDFA running back who just had a great rookie year.
You mean like Kyron Williams last year?
Like Kyron Williams, like Isaiah Pacheco, like James Robinson, like Michael Carter. Like, there's been a lot of them that didn't work also. But we've seen Kyron do it 2 years in a row. So can we just cross our fingers and hope Bucky and Chase Brown do too?
You can cross your fingers and hope so. But I think there will be some complications.
Yes.
Their cases, the chief among them being they're going to get company. Heath, you mentioned earlier there's like 20 running backs in this draft class that you love. Dan, I'm sure you'd back that up and say that this is a very deep class of running back. Here we have 2 running backs that helped carry their offenses to the finish line. One got in the playoffs, the other one fell just short, but they were sharing. And now there's so many players that could end up sharing with them that are coming into the league right now. And that makes me a little bit nervous. It's going to be easy for Cincinnati to find another running back if they're going to just move on from Zach Moss. You know, that wouldn't be surprising. It might be a smidge of surprising for the Bucs to move on from Rachaad White, but you can see it happening. Rachaad White hasn't been an effective runner for 2 seasons now, and Bucky Irving is effective, and he's proven that he can do it. So I get a little nervous about them being any higher than this. I think they're appropriate in tier 4. I'm glad you're not rushing them up the ladder a little bit, and you've got them in the same tier as Saquon Barkley, and I'm not ready to write off Saquon.
And we got a little technical difficulty there with Dave's sound, I think.
We lost Dave for a second.
We lost Dave, but I can hear Dan. And Dan, as much as I agree with Dave's concerns about Bucky and Chase Brown, they aren't even the 2 running backs who make me the most nervous in this tier. It's Ken Walker. I don't know what to do with a guy who's explosive and has the upside that Walker does, but also Zach Charbonnet looked better at the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the offense runs better with Charbonnet in there because of the way that he runs. But Walker gives them the upside of the explosive play that Charbonnet may not give them. So it's really a pick and choose. The best coaches will probably find a way to utilize both. But that gets me to some of my concern with some of the players we discussed, because I would agree. Look, Walker's probably the most concerning, but Bucky and Chase Brown, those guys would scare the hell out of me if I had them and I was valuing them, or if I was trying to trade them and valuing them in a tier like this. To me, Bucky, love what I saw. I thought his NFL tape was better than his college tape, despite playing against slower defenders in college and worse defenders in college. That's how good I think he can be. But I'm concerned when you lose Liam Cohen, when I read stuff like Sean McVay saying, wow, this is the core. This is my system, what Liam's running at the core, but he's doing stuff in the run game that shocked even me when I watched the tape. And so now you lose that from the run game in Tampa, right? And then on the other hand, it's Chase Brown, who was never built to be a workhorse back. He had 1 season where he did it at Illinois and kind of did it, I should say. But, there's no guarantee that's going to be the case moving forward. As Dave mentioned, stacked loaded class. The plan for Cincinnati originally wasn't to make him a workhorse. It was Zach Moss until he got hurt. So those guys scare me more. And Dave was getting to the point, Heath, but I got to say, I'm with Dave. I don't know if he still was going to get here with this point, but I'm with Dave. Barkley to me doesn't really belong in this tier. Barkley belongs in a tier above, and maybe even a tier above that for me. I understand he's 28, but I think we're over emphasizing age here when we're talking about a 2-3 year difference for what is a generational player versus a non-generational player. Like, we've done this with Derrick Henry for the last 4 years, and he's just a freak of nature that defines all physics and all logic. And Barkley is the same thing. I know he's had more injuries in his history than Derrick Henry, but one of those injuries is just pure luck. He's running a route over the middle and steps on the foot of a Dallas defender, and it ruins the season. He had an ACL as well, and then he had an MCL sprain. Like, outside of that, he was fully healthy this season. He had a fully healthy season for the Giants in 2022, essentially. So it's like, I would say that Barkley, when I look at this just as a whole, I don't really like to see Barkley in a tier with these guys. I just couldn't value those guys the same personally. He's the only workhorse. He was the only workhorse in any of these tiers, really.
Well, it's really about how much, like, you couldn't have said this about Saquon Barkley coming into this coming year.
Right. You're right. But maybe you should have, is the point.
Well,
like,
no, I think what we saw is how much Saquon Barkley benefited from the situation.
Right.
Like, let me just Heath rant for a moment here, because we've heard all week long about how the defensive plan is just make Jalen Hurts beat you and just take the ball away from Saquon Barkley. And the Eagles would be nothing without Saquon Barkley, and Jalen Hurts is just along for the ride. Jalen Hurts was going to Super Bowls before he had Saquon Barkley.
One Super Bowl.
Jalen Holt went to a Super Bowl and was going to the playoffs all but 1 year. Saquon Barkley played 2 playoff games in 6 years before he joined Jalen Hurts. Saquon Barkley was averaging 4.4 yards per touch over the last 4 years of his career, and then goes to Philadelphia, and all of a sudden he's averaging 6. Like, this situation this year.
I know what you're saying. That the narrative that Barkley is the reason for that team is ridiculous. I mean, look at it even more. Like, be smart about football and understand it's Jeff Stoutland and the 5 offensive linemen there. They bring in Mekhi Becton. All of a sudden, he's one of the most dominant right guards in the NFL. Cam Jurgens, they draft him before they need him. He's immediately amazing at center. Right. Landon Dickerson has an ACL, so he falls to round 2. He's immediately one of the best guards in the NFL. Jordan Mailata, a 7th round pick that goes to Jeff Stoutland University. He becomes one of the best left tackles in the NFL. And Lane Johnson very legitimately has a case to be made that he's the best right tackle in NFL history. Literally NFL history. So that's 5 of those guys, Jeff Stoutland, and a quarterback who can run, and you have to, and when they run zone read, you can't crash down on Barkley. So the Barkley narrative is ridiculous. Okay. I'll agree with you on that. The
rant's over, Aaron. You're right. This is what grinds my gears, but we do need to get back to the list because what you said, Dan, I think could be very much true about the next tier. We get to tier 5, and this is a place where I did kind of go with archetype over just a strict value. But we have Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry. Like, these should be your win now backs, but I feel a little bit less certain about them than I do Barkley, which is why they are a tier behind him. But I just wonder, like, let's say you've got a true contending roster, Dan, and you have Bucky Irving or Chase Brown. How many of these backs, Jacob, Mixon, McCaffrey, Kamara, and Henry, are you trading those much younger backs for?
Great question. I think without a doubt, Jacobs. You know, I'm much higher than you are on him in Dynasty. I had him. I'm big on him. He just signed the contract with Green Bay. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Jordan Love's under contract. Great infrastructure. So definitely Jacobs. The rest of them is where it gets interesting. I think I'm definitely way more willing to trade Chase Brown than I am Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving looked much better on tape to me than Chase Brown. Bucky Irving looked like he could legitimately be a star on tape. So that's the one I'd be scared to trade. But as far as Chase Brown goes, I'll give him up for McCaffrey in a heartbeat. I'll give him up for Henry if I'm contending, not Kamara, maybe Mixon. And do not like seeing that Bengals graphic next to Mixon, though. Great job. I don't want to take a shot at Thomas. He's the man, but we had one. We don't like to see the
Dan, is this your first video show? You don't say that. It gets fixed in post, and then it looks good later. Come on, Dan. Let's take a short break so Dan can recover from that.
I need to recover from
flub, and we'll get to tier 6 after this.
My eyes deceive me.
The clock never stops. Relive the greatest moments with uninterrupted highlights and more.
It's Gareth Bale! Ronaldo! Wonderful goal!
On the UEFA Champions League channel. Streaming free.
Tier 6 is the mega tier, and maybe the last tier that we're going to talk about at running back today. Chuba Hubbard. That's hilarious. David Montgomery, Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, James Conner, DeAndre Swift, J.K. Dobbins, Brian Robinson, Aaron Jones, Najee Harris, Tony Pollard, and Ramondre Stevenson. And yes, there's like 5 or 6 young backs you might really like that I put in the tier below because I don't even know if they're going to be starting running backs next year. So we're just going to talk about this tier 6. I want you to kind of look at the names. How many of these guys do you actually feel comfortable will be like an RB2 next year?
Great question. I'll say, so first I want to start with James Conner, who I would put more in the veteran tier above him, especially since they re-signed him Arizona and everything we saw from Drew Pretzing and the health of that run game. So that would be the first one for me that I feel comfortable with. I want to say Pacheco. I mean, could they really bring back Kareem Hunt? Maybe. If you're Kareem Hunt, if you're the Chiefs, you can probably find a good, reasonable contract there. And I don't see why Kareem Hunt would want to play anywhere else. So that scares me a bit. I want to bring 2 guys to the forefront here, though. It's tough because I don't know which one will have more value. I'll go with my guy, though, the guy I think is more talented and a better runner on tape, and it's Tank Bigsby. And why am I excited about him potentially as an RB2? Because Liam Cohen's going over there, and Liam Cohen designed one of the best run games in football this year behind the Lions and maybe a couple others. So that gets me excited about a guy who's been really talented on tape, had some injuries. So I want to throw Tank Bigsby in there. J.K. Dobbins will be dependent if he resigns. Brian Robinson a little bit lower on. Tony Pollard, how about him? He's under contract, just signed it last year. The expectation, the hope is the Titans will improve at quarterback. That I don't know about, and I can't say for sure whenever you're drafting a quarterback, if they even do. But I will say this, the offense that Callahan brought in, I'm talking about his father, I'm talking about, they blocked well. And Latham played unbelievable this year, as did Skoronski, who took a big jump from year 1 to year 2. So that O-line is going to become one of the 10, maybe even top 8, 7 best in the NFL over the next year or two. I want to have a running back in that offense.
Just really, really quick. DeAndre Swift gets Ben Johnson. Is that a positive because he gets Ben Johnson, or a negative because 3 years ago Ben Johnson just played Jamal Williams over him?
Yeah, great point. I'm going to go with negative. Negative's fine. I think it's pretty much net neutral. I'm not a huge fan of Swift.
Let's jump to the wide receiver position and get Dan fired up right away because I did it. I put Jamar Chase in a tier of his own, all alone. It's been him and Justin Jefferson for the past 3 years. I've gone back and forth on. CeeDee Lamb was definitely a part of that group for about 15 minutes. But after the year we just saw, with the quarterback question marks that we have for Jefferson, I'm putting Jamar Chase in a league of his own at the wide receiver position.
I think that's fair. I think what we just saw from a dominant standpoint, the idea that Higgins might be gone, that could lead to even more production. The rapport that just continues to build between Burrow and Chase. And then most importantly for me, just looking at some of the breakdowns this season of what Joe Burrow did, that wrist injury did impact him more than people realize, but he worked with his quarterback trainer and found a way to utilize more of his lower half and generating force from the ground to get that arm strength back that he may have lost or just playing through the injury. And from what I saw, this was actually the best version of Joe Burrow this year. So I'm excited about what he's going to do moving forward. So yeah, I like that pick with him in his own tier.
I've got 6 wide receivers in tier 2, which is more than there used to be. Justin Jefferson, Malik Neighbors, Puka Nacua, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Brian Thomas Jr. Any of these guys not belong? Any of these guys should be lower, or you agree with this group?
Heck no. I completely agree with this group. Maybe the order we could debate on and have fun with, but this is an elite group.
Let's get to tier 3 and tier 4 then.
You real quick, Heath.
Okay.
Is there anyone in that group, obviously we're not going to talk about tier 1, that you would you take a running back? Okay, maybe Bijan. Would you take any running back not in your tier 1, because there's only 2 players, over anyone in that group?
Yeah, I would.
Okay.
Actually, I take it back. I was just looking at my trade chart, and it actually does go exactly in order. The first 7 wide receivers, and then Bijan and Gibbs are almost tied with Brian Thomas Jr. But no, I've got
I don't know if I would take any of those running backs over any of those receivers, though. That's how good I feel about them long term. Maybe over Puka. Not that I don't like Puka's talent. Again, I'm just really worried about what's going to happen with that Rams quarterback situation.
I will say that I would take 3 running backs over tier 3 wide receivers, which is what we're going to next. Okay. And I've only got 2 guys there, and I don't feel confident in how I broke these 2 groups up. So let's just talk about them together. Tier 3, I have Nico Collins, I have Jackson Smith and Jim.
Wow.
Tier 4, Lad McConkey, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jordan Addison, Drake London, Garrett Wilson, and AJ Brown. I would say the AJ Brown one almost needs an asterisk because this wide receiver position has gotten so young.
I know.
There's not a wide receiver who will even be 27
Wow.
next year in my top 14. AJ Brown is 15th, and he'll be 28 next year. So 2 years older than any other wide receiver we've talked about so far. 3, 4, 5 years older, 6 years older than some of them. So that's why he's so low. If you're a true contender, he certainly needs to be higher. But first off, like where I drew that line, is this just all one tier, or should I have drawn the line somewhere else?
I would be okay with moving this to 1 tier if we move Nico up to tier 2. Nico Collins, to me, belongs in tier 2 for sure. Just a phenomenal player. His yards per route run was historically good, and he has CJ Stroud tied to him. The rest of them, I'm okay moving into their own tier. I would be lower and higher on some players, but I think it makes sense. And I think it does make sense to keep AJ Brown, despite his age, in this tier.
I will say with Nico, like I have come around on the idea of how elite he is.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't yet seen the target volume, maybe necessarily to put him in that tier 2.
Okay.
Like even last year, he only played 12 games, but 99 targets. The year before in 15 games, only had 109 targets. He would actually be challenging with his efficiency numbers that you've mentioned to be amongst the most elite producers if we could see 10, 11 targets per game from Nico Collins like we see from a lot of the guys in the first 2 tiers. Dave is back. Dave, you see this list here. We've got Lad McConkey, Marvin Harrison Jr., a couple of rookies in this tier, but the one I get the most question about is Jordan Addison, Drake London, and Garrett Wilson all in the same range, because we've had a couple of years here where we just, as soon as Drake London gets a quarterback, he's going to be a top 2 or 3 tier guy. Garrett Wilson, as soon as he gets a quarterback, Jordan Addison doesn't necessarily have a quarterback, but he's outproduced these guys the last 2 years.
He's also got Justin Jefferson. And I think back to when the night that Jordan Addison was drafted, and I think it was you and I, Heath, that were talking about him, that he was always going to be in the shadow of Jeddah. And that means 1,000 yards or so, 7 touchdowns or so. And he's been better than that. And I just feel like he's never going to be that number 1 guy. And maybe it's a little too much to put him in this high of a tier. I'd probably push him back at least 1 tier, knowing that everybody else in this group has upside to be better than 1,007.
When you talk about he's never going to be, he's already made it through 2 years of that contract.
Mm-hmm.
He's still younger than these guys.
Mm-hmm.
Like he may just be that guy in 2 to 3 years if Minnesota can't afford to pay just 2 elite wide receivers, the same problem that Cincinnati is getting ready to go through.
Sure, but I guess that could be an issue. Am I willing to wait for that and cross my fingers for that, knowing that there's plenty of things that can happen between now and then that could drag down Addison's value? And the answer to that is no, I'm not willing to, especially with I don't know how many names exactly you have in tier number 5, but I know it's more than what you've got in tier number 4. And that means between these 2 tiers, I've got plenty of options ahead of getting Jordan Addison on my team and then patiently waiting 24 months to see what happens with his contract, which, by the way, he could end up re-signing in Minnesota and still being the number 2 receiver there. We'll see how that goes, but we're not going to know it for 24 months.
Yeah, I guess the 24 argument is fair. I think he can produce, like Garrett Wilson has had a chance to be that number 1 and has produced a lot like Jordan Addison as a number 2.
I agree.
So maybe
Sure.
both Addison and Wilson should be in a lower tier. London at least looks like maybe he's figured something out. Let's get to tier 5, which I guess would be the mega tier for this discussion. It's a lot of names: T. Higgins, Jamison Williams, Xavier Worthy, Devontae Smith, Zay Flowers, Roma Dunze, Rashee Rice, Jalen Waddle, Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, and Chris Olave. And Dan, I'll just go to the name that made Dave, say wow. It's
No,
Rice.
there wasn't a name that made me say wow.
Just how
I'm
many it
wowing
was?
the list of names.
Yes, it's Rice. I think is currently one of the most difficult wide receivers to rank because I don't believe. I mean, he's obviously not fully healthy yet, or he'd be playing football for the Chiefs in the playoffs. And we've got a potential suspension that we expect to happen this season.
Right.
And like Xavier Worthy's kind of taken the same path that Rice did as a rookie and become a focal point in the offense in the second half of the season. And so I think there's a little bit of question whether Rice will see the same target volume he did at the beginning of this year now that Worthy's more acclimated. How close would you value Rice and Worthy today in Dynasty?
That's an amazing question. I was so high on Rice before any of the news happened with the suspension and obviously the injury. I'm not going to hold against him because players get injured and they would come back from it. But I loved Worthy coming out too. We talked about it with Dave. When I watched his tape at Texas, he wasn't just the John Ross one-trick pony. And we're starting to see that with the Chiefs. He's really improved. I would probably have them about where you have them, but I might have Rice a tad bit lower is where I would probably be at with it.
Dave, T. Higgins, hopefully back on the Bengals, but we don't really know for sure.
I don't think it's happening.
You think that they won't franchise him again?
I don't think they'll franchise him again. I think that they're going to let him roll, and there will be a line of teams ready to sign him.
So here's my concern. I think some people look at that and think, oh, T. Higgins is finally going to get to go be a number one. I think if he just goes to get the most money, he's probably going to go to a much worse situation. Does he go up or down if he goes to the New England Patriots?
So I'm going to measure this tier at the same type of range that I said for Jordan Addison. And just to be clear, Jordan Addison does have 10 touchdowns in each of his first 2 seasons, but he's under 1,000 yards in each. So that general range, it all comes out to like the same amount of fantasy points when you look at it. I think T. Higgins can be 1,007 in New England as soon as next year with Drake May. But I don't know if he'll ever be 1,310 with the Patriots. I just don't know if he's that dynamic of a wide receiver. Big-bodied perimeter type guy, high volume capability. Yeah, he's got those things. But I don't know if he can be like a top 10 receiver in the NFL and get to that level of 1,310 like we would want him to get to. And that's why he's in tier 5. So he probably wouldn't even be my favorite wide receiver in this tier. I think Odunze might have a little bit more upside long-term. I want to say Waddle and Olave have more upside long-term, but it's tough to really envision that.
Yeah, Olave is someone I've pretty much been lower on for the last few years in Dynasty. And one of these years, he might make me look ridiculous for that. Dan, we look at tier 6, last wide receiver tier we'll do today. George Pickens, DJ Moore, Josh Downs, Khalil Shakir, Quentin Johnston, Deebo Samuel, Jaden Reed, Keon Coleman. I'm sure Quentin Johnston's going to be everyone's least favorite. Who's your favorite wide receiver in this tier, Dan?
For me, it's George Pickens, the guy you have up at the top. He's the only one I look at of this group and say, this could be the Alpha X dominant fantasy receiver like a Jamar Chase, who in the right situation with the right quarterback will be a top 3, top 4 fantasy option. I guess you could still say DJ Moore has that upside. I don't personally believe it, despite having Caleb Williams, who I do believe in, tied to him. It's too much competition. Keon Coleman's somebody we've talked about in the past, somebody I'm higher on the consensus, but not in that range. So it would be Pickens for me. He's shown the ability to win at all 3 levels. Even when they started to use him in quick game on those slants and just winning off the line of scrimmage with his release, he was able to do that. And on some of those, he took those slants and then housed them or took them for big gains. He has like post-catch upside that is not often discussed when it comes to George Pickens. Just from what I've seen on tape, he's by far the most elite receiver of this group. I'd even put him above the tier 4 from a talent standpoint, or tier 5 from a talent standpoint. Just situation still unknown.
Well, I think that's the real risk is like we might be 2 months from finding out that Russell Wilson has gone to Las Vegas to join Pete Carroll and Justin Fields is George Pickens' quarterback for this season. And he's probably going to see his value even fall from this. Dave, Deebo Samuel is a guy who has speaking of fallen, has fallen plenty in redraft and dynasty ranks. Does he need a new home?
In the NFL or in your tiers?
NFL.
No, I don't think he's going to necessarily get one. Maybe he's a cap candidate, so maybe. But 29 years old, frequently injured. Last year he played through injury. He looked terrible in the second half of the season. Maybe started to get it back a little bit toward the end of the year. I know you're not showing tier 7, but names like Godwin, Devontae, Tyreek Hill, Mike Evans, I know the shelf life isn't long for them. It's not long for Deebo Samuel either. And I'd still rather have all those other wide receivers than Deebo Samuel in Dynasty.
Let's get to the tight end position. And like one of my favorite things, and I will say, like if Dave mentioned we didn't get to tier 7, we haven't got to tier 7 in any position. You'll be able to see tier 7 on CBS Fantasy probably next week, maybe later this evening if some of those get put up, but we will have written content with all of my tiers. So if anybody you're missing, you'll be able to see that later on the website. But one of my favorite things about tiers is they're so much better than rankings, except Dan at the tight end position, because the first 3 tiers are exactly the same as rankings. Brock Bowers in a tier of his own, Trey McBride in a tier of his own, Sam Laporta in a tier of his own, especially for dynasty purposes. Yeah. Let's assume it's not a super, it is super flex, but it's not a tight end premium league. How high is too high for Brock Bowers and Trey McBride?
So wait, rephrase that for me. How high overall are we talking?
Yeah.
In a non-premium, non-super flex. I was having this debate, I believe, with Adam about redraft. So for Dynasty, I think his value becomes even greater. It goes back to like part of my old strat, like 2-3 years ago, Heath, when I evaluated Kyle Pitts' film out of Florida, I thought he was the next big thing just based on his tape. And I was like, this is the guy I'm going to make aggressive plays to get in Dynasty, because if I get him, I get such an advantage on a weekly basis at the tight end position. Now that's become Brock Bowers, who, by the way, had better tape than Kyle Pitts and was an even better version of that. If you watch him at Georgia, and actually look good in year 1, unlike Kyle Pitts. Or Kyle Pitts was okay. I think he had 1,000 yards, but not like Bowers. So I'm going to double down on the strategy, Heath, and I'm going to say this. I think you could take him at the back end of round 1.
Brock Bowers is my number 12 non-QB in Dynasty.
So we have the same exact idea on this.
Trey McBride is number 24 for me. And Sam Laporta is somewhere in round 4. Let's just jump ahead, Dave, to tier 3 and tier 4, because I think that's where actually it's going to matter to people. I do put Laporta in a tier all of his own, but then tier 4 is where it really feels like, man, is it just win now or bust? I have Sam Laporta by himself in tier 3. Tier 4 is Mark Andrews, George Kittle, TJ Hawkinson, and Dalton Kincaid. I think people know what Kittle is. He's your Derrick Henry of the tight end position. If he remains himself, he's a league winner. If he falls off, well, he's the age where he could fall off. Where are you at on TJ Hawkinson? Are you holding last year against him at all? Do you think he bounces back? Because he was a pretty clear top 3 tier guy for a long time.
And I on one hand, I don't want to hold last year against him, but on the other hand, how do I vouch for a guy who might be 3rd on the Vikings in targets with a new quarterback? If I'm going to poo-poo Jordan Addison and say, well, we know what his ceiling is going to be, I kind of feel like we know what the ceiling is going to be for TJ Hawkinson.
Yeah.
And we saw it in 2023. I would not spend tier 4 type capital on TJ Hawkinson. 28 years old. That's 2 years older than Dalton Kincaid. 3rd fiddle in the offense. We don't know for sure if he's ever going to be his old self. It's a great offense to be in, and I'm glad he's there, but there's too many questions to put him up this high. I don't think he belongs. I think he's he's in a tier 2 high, if not 2 tiers.
So I was going to ask Dan to make the case for Dalton Kincaid, but it sounds like, because I could understand saying that Andrews and Kittle should also get their own tier, and maybe like tier 1 through 12 should just be 12 tight ends. But I don't, Dave, do you have a case to be made that Dalton Kincaid is more desirable than TJ Hawkinson? Because I have, there's nothing that Dalton Kincaid has done that's been encouraging in the NFL.
And this is another player that had great film coming out of Utah and was an interesting player in the draft, and he high draft capital to go to Buffalo. And for whatever reason, the Bills just have not committed to him. We saw it now. 91 targets as a rookie, 75 in 3 fewer games in his second season, 4 total touchdowns. Doesn't seem to be the explosive seam buster that we thought that he would be. I don't think he belongs in tier 4 either. I think giving him the benefit of the doubt after 29 regular season games and a couple of playoff games would be a mistake on draft day. I think I'd rather get Kittle and then either draft another tight end in a tier 5, tier 6, or just wait a year to get another tight end or pick somebody off the waiver wire if I'm building out a dynasty team.
There are, looks like 67 players, Dan, since the start, 67 non-running backs since the start of 2023 that have seen at least 150 targets. 150 targets over the last 2 years. Here are the players who have averaged fewer yards per target than Dalton Kincaid. There's a few of them. Dalton Schultz, Tyler Conklin, Jake Ferguson, Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Elijah Moore, Wan'Dale Robinson, and then this is going to make you terribly sad, Garrett Wilson. Just like the most because I hear some people say that Dalton Kincaid's really not been given a chance yet, so we don't really know. He's just been really inefficient with the chances that he has gotten. Do you have a lot of hope still for Dalton Kincaid?
This, I think, is a big blind spot in the way I build out Dynasty and just the way I approach fantasy, because I looked at that list and I said to myself, I would not trade a single one of those. I would not trade Dalton Kincaid for a single one of those players listed above him. And then I heard Dave's analysis and I was like, this is a blind spot, because you have to at some point put away what you saw on tape at college and understand that. And I'm not saying this is going to be the case with Dalton Kincaid. I want to make that clear. It's only 2 years into his career.
Right.
But it is possible that the speed of the game is different for him. The tape I watch of him at Utah against that level of play, those defenses he faced every week, it's a similar situation with Zach Wilson when he played at BYU. It's very similar. Reminds me of a similar thing. It's so different than the speed of the NFL game. And I haven't seen on tape that player against NFL competition. Now, I think there's other issues. I don't think this Joe Brady system is good at all for Dalton Kincaid, literally at all. And it's going to be here and it's going to stay. There's no sign that he's not going to be back next year. Maybe he'll get a head coach job. I don't know. But, if he's back, which I think he will be, that's bad news for Dalton Kincaid. This is not how I envisioned them using him when they drafted him. This is not at all how Utah used him in their offense. So in this system, with what I've seen on tape so far from an NFL standpoint, I have to adjust. And I have to just look at this thing like, there's enough evidence, because otherwise I'm going to fall into the same trap I fell into with Kyle Pitts. And I'm already envisioning it happening again. And I don't want it to happen again. So I don't want to defend Dalton Kincaid right now.
Okay, you don't have to defend Dalton Kincaid right now.
You don't have to, but let me ask you this. Have you seen enough of Tyler Warren to make a decision on Warren, who's going to be a rookie this year in the NFL, versus Kincaid?
Yes, I would take Warren over Kincaid for sure.
I think I would too.
Warren reminds me of somebody brought that's not my comp, but ever since I heard it, I cannot get it out of my head. A little bit like Jeremy Shockey. And Jeremy Shockey was such a fun player when he was in his prime with the Giants and a little bit with the Saints.
Yeah, total bully.
How could we have ever guessed, Dave, that it would have been a Giants tight end? How could we have ever guessed? Dan, Dave, thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you to everybody who was active in the chat. Appreciate Thomas with those fantastic graphics. I don't know what Dan is talking about. And just really appreciate you guys supporting the show. We're going to wrap this up. Again, you can go find all of my tiers for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, on tight end. They'll all definitely be up by next week. Other than that, we will talk to you next Tuesday.